Guillermo del Toro is an absolute master of horror, so were fans quite excited when Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities finally arrived on Netflix? Some of the 1-hour-long episodes were original concepts, while others were inspired by short stories, but all of them deliver a particular aspect of horror. Think body horror, or the supernatural. This anthology series is filled to the brim with amazing actors and directors who all brought some very creepy stories to life, but not all creepiness was divided equally among the 8 episodes of the collection. However, it's still fascinating to see the scary stories Del Toro has curated for us in this particular collection. So let's take a look at Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities ranked by scariness. The first episode we're talking about is also the first episode of the collection. And while it was a pretty decent story, it wasn't very scary. Lot 36 tells the story of a man who tries to pay off his debts by flipping storage units. But then he finds some otherworldly things in one particular storage unit. It's a pretty predictable story. You get the idea that it's going to be a spiritual horror, but has some monster elements as well. Much like the next episode, Dreams in a Witch House. This episode definitely deals with the supernatural horror. It follows Walter as he attempts to find a way to see his dead twin sister. The episode unquestionably has some creepy elements, and the main protagonist is pretty well designed. The story is decently interesting as well, and the ending is kinda bizarre, but there's just something about it. Dreams in a Witch House just doesn't quite cut it. Maybe it's the small evil rodent that just looks comically bad and not scary at all. It kind of takes you out of any kind of haunting feeling the episode carries, don't you think?
I will have you.
And to be honest, the same also goes for The Murmuring. This next episode follows Nancy and Edgar, a couple that likes birdwatching. Again, it's not a bad piece of television, but the episode focuses more on the interpersonal relationship between Nancy and Edgar than anything else. The most supernatural horror, The Murmuring, dives into the past trauma of the couple. While it's definitely not a waste of time, there are probably better things to watch out there. Maybe another episode of Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities?
I'll be back next Sunday to drop off supplies. Happy bird watching.
The Outside revolves around Stacy, who is routinely neglected by her coworkers. The thing that gets me about this episode is the way it was filmed. Somehow the upward camera angle of Stacy's coworkers really adds a sense of eeriness to the whole setting. The subtle way something seemingly so insignificant, like a camera angle, can really get under your skin is very impressive. Maybe that's why the peeling of Stacy's skin, which is supposed to be the real horror here, isn't very scary at all. Or maybe we all fear what other people may be able to do to us, even with seemingly mundane words, more than the thought of our skin peeling off. Either way, The Outside isn't the worst episode of the bunch, but it definitely gets better with Pinkman's Model. This episode tells the story of William, a painter. William is having a bit of an existential crisis after looking at a painting that was made by one of his classmates. To say that William is struggling would be an understatement, but the goal of this episode is more to disturb rather than scare the viewer. This is proven by the fact that there's only one proper jump scare in the entire episode. A decent jump scare though. The rest of the episode is also filled with memorable moments that are pretty curious. And if Pinkman's Model has one flaw, it has to be its monster. It shows up a few times throughout the episode, but it's really more comical than it is frightening. That's probably why this episode didn't make it higher on the list. Overall, Pinkman's Model is a moderately disturbing episode that flows like the ocean. It's not good, it's not bad, which isn't something that can be said for the next episode. The Viewing is very good. It tells the story of a wealthy old man who has a gathering with 4 strangers. Each of these strangers is an expert in their respective field. It's true that this episode is a bit of a diesel. It takes a while before it gets going. The beginning of the episode is interesting enough, but it really doesn't get scary until about 15 minutes in. But once this episode gets going, there's no turning back. especially the last few moments of the episode deliver some impressive scares. And the final monster is easily the best looking and scariest monster of all in the series. On top of that, the viewing has the most compelling story of the series as well. However, I kind of feel like there were some missed opportunities here, and the episode would probably have benefited from more screen time for its monster as well, which is why Graveyard Rats ended up being a little bit better than the viewing. Graveyard Rats went absolutely to town with its monsters. This episode follows a grave robber who's paying off his debts with the artifacts he steals from the dead. That is, until evil rodents foil his plans and get him into a lot of trouble. But even with the rats scurrying about, this episode was psychologically very scary as well. In the first half, you're confronted with some dead bodies, one particular visual with a lot of rats that will, beyond a doubt, leave you a little bit scared, and then there's a sequence in the tunnels underground. Very tight tunnels. Even if you don't actually suffer from claustrophobia, that moment will have you holding your breath. And not in the least, because, you guessed it, there were rats in this sequence as well. If anything, this episode will definitely give you the creeps, which means that it's an absolute must-watch.
So you telling me rats is stealing bodies out of coffins?
And then we're left with only one remaining episode of Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities, The Autopsy, this final episode, which means that it's without a doubt the scariest episode of the 8 that were included in this collection. Follows a police officer and a coroner who try to solve a mystery of an explosion in a mine shaft. What makes this episode tick are the slow burn scares. Maybe it's a bit of a slow burn in general, but that's because this is just the kind of story that takes a while to establish itself. It's not always good to rush things, you know? However, the episode really takes off when the coroner is alone at last. Alone to do what he does best, examine dead bodies. How lovely. The episode does a really great job creating suspense while Carl is slicing up the dead miners. But I think we can all agree that the best aspect of the episode was when Carl had to disassemble himself and started to stab away at his own eyes, ears, and throat. To be honest, I couldn't even watch. If you'd asked me, I could have done without the alien storyline of The Autopsy. It wasn't very scary. Maybe even a little bit boring. Maybe less would have been more in the case of this episode. Even so, The Autopsy was arguably the best episode of Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities. This episode was filled with moments that make you want to gag and has you covering your eyes. But whichever episode of this collection of curiosities was your personal favorite, these were Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities ranked by scariness.